Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Jessica Schafer. It is wonderful to return to this community as an alumni. I concluded my doctoral research and degree with Walden in 2020. My leadership specialization and coursework has certainly assisted me in personal and professional development. I've continued with employment in the U.S. federal government before, during, and onwards after my degree. My committee, led by Dr. Snyder, was critical in guiding me during my doctoral journey. So what I'd like to do now is go ahead and talk about the outcomes from my study, which have not only further enhanced my personal development in so many ways, for which I'm grateful and I'm ready to share with you today. I am especially honored to have this opportunity to present my research results to you during the symposium. And now on to the results. Next slide, please. For my problem statement, compared to previous generations at the same age, millennials, and the research is all over about this, but generally millennials are born in the 1980s and 1990s. That's the best way to capture the generation. Millennials have been less likely to go to church, volunteer through faith-based organizations, and donate to faith-related missions. All of this despite research showing that millennials have interest in supporting social causes and increasing cause awareness. So there's information from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics showing that millennials have continued to grow in religious disaffiliation. Nearly 10% fewer millennials than Generation Xers, who are the generation before millennials, have volunteered for religious organizations from that 2014 to 2015 period alone. What does this mean? Some faith-based organizations, which I will refer to as either faith-based organizations or FBOs, are negatively affected by this downward trend in millennial support, resulting in a reduced ability to fulfill their missions. And some FBO leaders lack strategies to engage millennials. So to study this practitioner problem, I chose a qualitative research method. So the purpose of this qualitative multiple case study was to explore FBO leader strategies to engage millennials. The population included 7 leaders from 3 FBOs located in the Western United States. These leaders have implemented successful strategies for engaging millennials. So what is the significance of the study? Why is it important? Fewer people attending churches, to include young adults, ties to fewer giving and volunteering opportunities within communities. This brings to question the viability for FBOs that struggle to engage that generation and other generations potentially. So FBOs are important in their communities because they provide social outreach programs that include things such as supporting soup kitchens, refugee placement, and health services. Just a few of many examples of how FBOs are enrichment opportunities within the communities that they reside in. The results of this study are of potential application to FBOs whose leaders struggle to engage millennials, even if those leaders have had success with other generations' participation. At the end of this presentation, I'll have immediate actions available that FBO leaders can adapt to their FBO's specific environments. So for the conceptual framework, I chose the value co-creation or VCC model as the lens for exploring successful strategies used by FBO leaders to engage millennials to result in mutually beneficial value during their experiences. Why this model? Okay, I was in all my collection in the literature, I found a study by Grandy and Levitt in 2015, who in their study identified a need for more research on applying that model within religious organizations. There's not very much literature on applying the VCC model within religious organizations. So the purpose of the VCC model or value co-creation model is to understand how organizations work with stakeholders. What kind of stakeholders? It depends on the organization. Consumers, employers, attendees, participants, whatever stakeholders are specific to an organization. Why? To co-create meaningful experiences to those participating stakeholders. So working with stakeholders occurs through personalized interactions and meaningful experiences on different types of engagement platforms. That is, the meaning as determined by the involved individuals. The goal in value co-creation is to make products, services, experiences, whatever it could be, better than one person participating in the process could accomplish alone. We're better together, in other words. The best way to explain this model is through a very relevant and example that everyone probably could understand. Legos, okay? The Lego Bricks, Lego Ideas community, they have an online platform. You join the community and they have monthly contests. I know because I'm part of it. And I have kids, they have Legos. So usually through once or twice monthly contests, they have one where people can build brick ideas. One of them was build your idyllic vacation scene using 100 to 250 bricks. These participants submit their ideas through either real bricks or through software, and all the fans vote on their favorite model. These Lego Brick Masters, you might have seen a recent competition on this on TV, very popular. I know we watch it at home, but they Lego Brick Masters and Lego fans vote on the most popular scenes, and the winner gets their idea created into a Lego gift with purchase set. And so these kinds of things that Lego has done with its fan base inspires fans and Lego employees to work together for passion about Lego bricks and creative ideas, again, through an online engagement platform. That is a really good example of value co-creation in action. Next slide, please. So, relevant scholarship. I'm a visual person, so if this slide doesn't manifest that, I don't know what does. So let's start on the left. This is the manifestation of my literature review sources. It's important to listen to your faculty chair, your advisor. I listened really closely when he said, proceed from the known to the unknown. Not a lot of people know about the value co-creation model, but people understand, well, we try to understand who millennials are, but they're more commonly familiar with millennials than churches and then value co-creation. So I proceeded from the known to the unknown. And then I explored some alternative models to value co-creation. So as I proceeded from the known to the unknown, I looked for overlaps between these categories. For example, millennials and their faith, if they have faith, then perhaps millennials and they're exploring engagement. And then if engagement led to value co-creation, and then the value co-creation model and its use in churches, which, as I already explained, very little in that area. So in totality, I had 175 sources. 80% of those were peer reviewed. 63% of the 175 were from 2015 to more recent. Over 20% of those sources were seminal government works or non-peer reviewed sources, but I had to pull from a lot of different areas to understand the volume of literature that related to what I needed to fully understand this study before I embarked on field work. So the right-hand side of this chart is my visual summary of some of the material that I learned. So on the top right-hand corner, from the available literature on religion, faith, churches, their leaders, active and growing participation, and so much more. This represents kind of 7 of the main sources I pulled from to represent the biggest indicators as essential among religious or faith-based organizations that were growing. In most cases, multiple sources informed each slider along a continuum from one end to the other. I'll highlight just a couple of examples to explain what I mean. So there's one that is the second one down, faith in everyday life. In one extreme of the continuum, there is what might be labeled as Sunday Christianity in the literature. People who show up one time a week. I'll kind of pull that back a little bit. What if you only show up once per month, or Christmas and Easter only? And this is in the, again, Christianity, and in my study, it was focused on Protestantism, which doesn't include the Catholic faith. So there is the Sunday Christianity. And then as you slide in the continuum, you have those that where faith is guided not just on Sunday, but perhaps more often, those who show up and faith guides some things to most things, then to faith guides everything in life. Well, for growing churches, faith guides not everything, but most things. Growing churches, again, faith guides most things. So I'll highlight just one more example, and that's the one that's the way bottom one, where let's say priority of youth and young adults. For one extreme, there is no priority. Okay, there's no priority of youth and young adults. And then on growing to low, medium, and high priority in growing churches, it was an extremely high priority in growing churches that they placed that high priority on youth and young adults. And this is extremely important because you have to recognize the substantial support needed in this age range as they make multiple life transitions in a relatively short amount of time. Okay, so that's that top right. Let's go to the lower right-hand side. And this has to do with my conceptual framework of the value co-creation model. I'll peel apart this because there's a lot within this one chart. And so on the upper, and this was synthesized with 4 sources. On the upper half of the chart is the level of organizational engagement ranging from optimal on the left, proceeding towards suboptimal, and then disengagement on the right. On the bottom half, you have the associated value, okay, proceeding from, on the left side, value creation to abandon, diminished, and then negative value. And then in the bolded part where you have the middle of the arrow, you have the actual models associated from value co-creation, and then value non-creation, value diminution, and value co-destruction. So just I'll highlight the 2 extreme value or 2 extreme examples here. So in what I actually applied is when value co-creation exists, there's an optimal amount of engagement in our actions. It's a continual and iterative process there. Values created, and that's part of the value co-creation model. Now, as you walk down the continuum where you have suboptimal engagement, you might have the no value, or you've abandoned value because you couldn't optimally engage someone, right? Or you have diminished value. But value co-destruction was really the alternative model. And this could be an area for future study, although in Walden, sometimes it's discouraged because people don't really want to talk about their failures, right? But how could a value co-destruction lens illustrate what happens when mutual benefits do not occur, thereby illuminating viability difficulties experienced by organizations who fail to engage their members to the point of disengagement? Okay, so that's just an example of what I found in the literature. It was a very rich description there. And so I created this chart to really tie value to engagement. So next chart, please. All right, again, I'm a visual person. It's kind of what you get from me, but it helps me explain my process to some extent. And I'll set the stage with the sample before discussing the details on the research design. Again, I wanted to ask the question, what strategies do FBO leaders use to engage millennials? Obviously focusing on the successful side of leaders engagement. I set forth 2 criteria that the 3 FBOs met in the study, up in the upper right hand here. First, identifying as an FBO, faith-based organization. All 3 were churches. Second, the FBOs had grown in the last 5 years because of engaging millennials. Specifically for these 3 FBOs, their leaders believed their FBO had grown because the leaders had engaged a large number of millennials in relation to the size of the congregation, or they had outward-oriented aspects of their mission that appealed to millennials, thus drawing millennials in. Ideally, I wanted to have a broad sample of Protestant congregations across the U.S. of different affiliations and of different sizes. So if you refer to the table below, it was tough to make this bigger, but I had to work with a template here. So participating churches, the 3 churches represented different affiliations, Protestant affiliations that included denominational, interdenominational, and non-denominational. They included multiple location types within the Western U.S. as defined by the 2020 census, responsive suburbia, downtown dynamic, and a student/military community. 2 of the churches were considered large in size, meaning greater than 1,000 attendees. Not that they had members. We try not to go by membership size because that has been shown in research to be inflated sometimes by church leadership. This was by average attendance Who showed up, who filled quote unquote the pews. Okay, so over 1,000 attendees each week in church services. And then the third church was considered a medium-sized church, meaning greater than 100 attendees on average per week. The other attributes that are listed there, I won't go over them in detail, but you can review them at your leisure. But these attributes just contributed to what that specific church's journey, according to the demographic that they were in, whether it was the downtown or the suburban environment. It really described what they had to do in their specific strategy to engage millennials within that community. So while the sampling almost looked like maximum variation, it was better met by criterion sampling, because again, I was going after specific criteria. So for this study, going after the procedures and the data analysis, I chose a multiple case study because each church was its own case. Now, a multiple case study design was beneficial for the study because of what Yin refers to as the ability to collect multiple sources of evidence, such as interviews, observations, documentation. In a book that I read back in 2018, there's more than 6, but those were the 3 that were richest for me. Ahead of on-site data collection, I chose to familiarize myself with all the available online content, which was social media, websites, available videos, lots of rich material that was available to me. And then I proceeded to each organization for on-site data collection. I used methodological triangulation across each of those data types, and then implemented thematic analysis to code and identify major themes. So across all the cases, I interviewed 7 leaders that were representative of a variety of positions. Each position, they interacted with a lot of millennials, so thereby knowing best that they were engaging millennials. I observed 5 worship services. I observed over 8 different types of small to medium to large group activities. Some were information meetings, leadership meetings, mentorship sessions, worship music activities, prayer groups, a variety of activities. Next slide, please. So what did I find? Another visual, a couple of them. I found that the leader's understanding of millennials was really a meta pattern, or an interconnectedness among all the themes, representing a critical and foundational element to their strategies. The foundation of leaders' understanding of millennials is defined by leaders spending time with them. It seems obvious, but we really had to peel this apart. Leaders listened to the millennials, to understand how to welcome them into church environments. I considered how understanding millennials related to the value co-creation model. This finding extends knowledge on the meaningful and productive experiences inherent in the value co-creation model. The leaders in the study recognize that without understanding millennials and their expectations, millennials' needs would not be met, and they would lose connection with them. This was vital in the study. As leaders learned millennials' needs, leaders adapted learning groups to answer their questions, equip them better in their faith, build relationships with them, and empower them with leadership opportunities that fit millennials' interests. I found that millennials were leading millennials at some point because they related to them at their level. So from field work, I observed leaders taking interest in millennials by learning their names, asking their interests. One church leader mentioned asking millennials, "What do you care about?" Like just being overt about it instead of giving them another survey, right? Understanding who they are as a generation, because the leadership needs to understand what is important to them. They met millennials where they were at physically, emotionally, and spiritually. You can't just say, come to the church. Sometimes you got to go to them. There were 4 key themes that leaders implemented to engage millennials. As I discussed these key findings, each of the 4 columns there, all related to that interesting funnel, which I call the engagement funnel on the right. And I developed that to represent how leader strategies to engage millennials in the study, again, directly extends application of that value co-creation model in religious organizations. The most prevalent theme, all the way on the leftmost column, was that leaders created a sense of belonging and family and welcoming, supportive environments. Everyone wants to feel like they're part of something, right? This funnel on the right side is the engagement funnel. And that's how leaders connected millennials and helped them feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves, which is what millennials are craving right now. Leaders engage millennials through a narrowing funnel of group sizes according to millennials' age and stage. It concentrates people who gather in large groups of 100s to just slightly smaller than that, 15 to 75 or so, and then into really small groups, intimate groups, if you will, of less than 15. Okay, and these narrower opportunities really help millennials choose where, when, and how their levels of engagement, when they want to do that, to match their comfort levels. The purpose is to really get after when they want to do this at their comfort level again. So these medium-sized group activities go from just being a wallflower in the large group to starting to make friend connections. And so finally, in those more intimate small groups of less than 15, spiritual growth occurs and relationships deepen. When people are ready for small group engagement, they become vulnerable and ready to share in deep faith with others and learn. So in these groups, I found millennials, again, leading, listening, and talking with optimism and realism about what's next. The key, the absolute key in this building a sense of belonging is to welcome millennials so they feel known. So the second key finding was that leaders remain open to innovating practices that keep the church Christ-centered. Innovate, but keep the church Christ-centered. Leaders balance the organic versus programmatic nature of their activities, connected virtually and in person. And then they created these intergenerational connections, not just having millennial groups, but having opportunities to learn amongst generations. I'll often throw in these quotes from each of the leaders. One of the leaders said, Jesus's principles haven't changed, but the way we interpret and present them might have. Look at ourselves. What are we doing? What are we saying? Maybe they don't need to change. Maybe we do. It gives us an opportunity to look at ourselves, the church. So from that quote there, the key is to vary events to align with millennials' interests. You know, COVID changed how these leaders engaged their church communities as well. When people could not gather in person, they still wanted to connect. Although one church had a worldwide music ministry and extensive YouTube and Spotify following, they had very little outward social media and website presence otherwise. Along with the other churches, all three churches expanded their social media posts with online services, small group connections, and other services to keep their communities connected and going. So leaders innovated their practices to meet their communities where they were during COVID, which was online. They became more creative and continued their connections. The third key finding was that leaders built relationships that extend beyond church. You're not just meeting in a church building anymore. They did this by interacting with their folks. And they did this by establishing trust, listening to their stories, and sharing their own. Leaders cared about the issues that mattered to millennials, whether related to faith or not. Leaders facilitated millennials initiating supportive relationships with others inside and outside the church, build relationships that extend beyond church walls. I love this quote from one of the other leaders, and this is the key takeaway here. Millennials will show up for what they care about and when they feel cared for. Again, for what they care about and when they feel cared for. The fourth key finding was that leaders empowered and equipped people in their faith, in their life, and as leaders. Leaders supported the development of millennials so that millennials learned to lead inside and outside the church. They taught millennials how to apply faith, not just in the church, but in everyday life. We're leading and learning outside of Sundays. I observe millennials in invisible roles, not invisible, right? So they were leading out front. If you had a younger presence at church, they want to see someone and be related to plus or minus 10 years from their age range. If you're way beyond that plus or minus 10 years from their age range, they're not going to be able to relate to you as much in their stories. So that was a big takeaway that I learned from them. And so the millennials are out front leading worship, prayers, and it doesn't have to be the whole service. They could be invited to offer a prayer for folks. They could lead a small group, a large group, volunteer, serve food. The point is they were present in in the upfront. The key is to learn what millennials value as important and implement that to show that the leaders value it too. Next slide, please. Okay, so what does all this mean? The meta pattern, again, big word, but the meta pattern of understanding millennials and the resulting 4 themes is just a starting point, because each FBO had to tailor strategies that met their specific FBO's needs. And if you remember the difference across the case demographics, the leaders accordingly tailored what worked for their church. One church primarily focused on younger millennials fresh from college and starting their careers. Another church focused on professional millennials, exploring new relationships and careers. And the last church primarily focused on millennials and established relationships and starting families. These churches all shared in common that they dedicated staff to understanding their millennial demographics. And so that is going to always be evolving, understanding millennials in their various life stages and ages of life and faith. It's always evolving, and so should leaders' understanding of millennials and other generations so that they can innovate their strategies to engage them and meet their needs. So there were some limitations. I focused on just 3 Western U.S. FBOs and their ability to provide me with reliable documentation, access during observations, and accurate information during interviews. I was the only data collector, so that could represent some bias. I documented those strategies that I used to mitigate, but not eliminate that bias in my full study. I recommend you review those. I do have some recommended actions for practitioners, some for FBO practitioners, but also some for non-FBO practitioners to consider moving forward. First, understand millennials in their age and stage. So you can do that by dedicating staff to the task. Build relationships with millennials. Maybe identify a task force that goes to meet them physically where they're at, right? Emotionally, spiritually, whatever it is that's specific to your organization. Create courses to help equip people in their faith, if that's relevant to your organization. You can also establish private social media space and group notifications. A lot of them think social media, it's out there for the world to see, but these leaders have figured out ways to tailor it to private group sessions. Some of them only had text group notifications. There's a lot of very smart apps out there right now that can help leaders enable this. And if you don't know how to do it, charge a millennial to figure it out for you. They'll help educate you pretty darn quickly. Place millennials in leadership positions or other visible roles. I explained this one pretty well, but not just millennials. If you value diversity, place people of diversity in those roles as well. Gender diversity and other elements of diversity as well. There's a lot of ways to put this part of the action piece in place, not just millennials, but if you value age diversity, there's all kinds of reasons to place people of various leadership positions into those visible roles. And I recommend doing that by starting with mentorship as well. Have them side by side from you or with you in doing that. And then lastly, track engagement. There's a lot of ways and questions I had with how could you possibly do this? And it's going to be so different for each organization, but I recommend establishing some goals in doing this, because one of the churches didn't track what they were doing and if it was working well, and they inadvertently canceled a program that was working super well. You don't want that to happen. So figure out a way to track it that works for your organization, whether it's through how many people showed up. Does the room look like it has more? Do you need more chairs the next time? Right? Do you need more logins? If you use VPN, are you running out of VPN logins? I mean, there could be some simple ways. You might need more exquisite ways, but track engagement and what way works for your organization. And then implications for social change. I alluded to this initially and why this study was significant, but increased involvement of millennials in FBOs could contribute to greater societal good by expanding the outreach in the community with more volunteers. If millennials' active participation is expanding and they're saying, hey, you wouldn't believe what I did at this church this other week. And they're like, man, it was through a church. Absolutely. But you wouldn't believe it. We were getting kids with bikes and these kids, man, they gave me high fives and it just felt so good. And I can't describe that to you, but it was amazing. I mean, there's just what these churches did. the churches I studied would partner with charities involved in community cleanup, racial injustice outreach, Kids on Bikes fundraising, respite care support, because they told the church leaders that that's what they were interested in. So again, listen, understand, and they will say, hey, show up with me. And guess what? That was of interest to more millennials. So additional positive social change in communities could include getting millennials not only to volunteer, but gathering more millennials and other folks to volunteer too, because guess what? They're already interested in it. So it's not just in gathering and involving them through that church, but extending through the social fabric of the charities that these churches are already partnered with and improving those communities that they work in. So that's all I have. And the next few slides go over the resources I use, but I encourage you to look through the rest of my study, because there, as you saw, there was a volume of research that I had, and that it was hard to tailor and boiler it into just this presentation. So I stand or I sit available for your questions. Thank you so much.
And I want to thank you, Dr. Schafer, for sharing your research. I think your findings and recommendations are important, not just for faith-based organizations, but organizations of all types. So yes, we have the floor open to questions or comments and feedback. You can feel free to type in the chat or unmute yourself and speak live. I see some comments in the chat. Love the visuals and your energy. Yes, definitely the passion for your topic came through. Aretha commented, one of the key takeaways from your topic and your session is millennials will show up for what they care about and when they feel cared for.
Absolutely.
And there was a question up above. You stated you were talking about what millennials are craving right now. Can you return to that topic just a little bit and revisit that?
Yes, I was looking over here because I had my slides over here. Let's see. Let's see. So with what millennials are craving right now, they're craving that sense of belonging. So they really want to belong and be a part of something bigger than themselves. And so I think that that's one of the biggest things, which is why we see a lot of them. We call it, some of the research or literature out there has if you can search up spiritual homelessness, that's one of the terms that has been used a little bit, but you can apply or expand that to bouncing between jobs as an example. They really haven't figured out, we always say, what do you want to do or what do you want to be when you grow up? They're bouncing and not really having a sense of stability. Now, some have attributed that to they're wanting to try so many different things, but it's because they really don't have a solid foundation or a sense of, I would call it a beacon or a lighthouse to really fall back or guide them. And so providing that sense of stability, or in the research I found, a sense of belonging or a sense of purpose has been one of the guiding lights, I'll say. And it's truly something that, and it doesn't have to be necessarily a faith-based community, although in my research, it certainly has pointed to that, but just something, again, bigger than themselves, a passion, a pursuit that isn't fleeting.
Thank you. Another question posed in the chat, what is your why? Why did you pick this topic and what does it mean to you personally? So
thank you for asking that. I love that question. I felt a calling, if you will. I've been active in my church for quite some time, and I call myself an elder millennial. I'm right on the cusp. I'm a cusper. And so I followed a similar journey to this before I really delved into the research and understood, I guess, more about myself. But as I was reading this, I'm like, am I a millennial? Am I not? I'm really kind of a Gen X millennial, if you will. But I strayed away from the church myself, not because I didn't like it or disagree with it, or any of those reasons, but and so if I felt like this magnetic tug, not only to go back to the church, but my husband and I were starting a family, which is a common reason for some folks to return to the church. But because millennials have really strayed away from, not strayed away, but delayed a bunch of these natural adulthood milestones for so many different reasons, when will they, if they will return to the church, has been a big question. And that really goes to the foundation of faith-based organizations, not just faith-related charities, but churches, viability. And so as I naturally had, for me, returned to the church when starting family, I found that, wow, is the church a dying institution, was a fundamental core shaking question for me. And so not only was I trying to volunteer within my church, sitting on advisory boards, something I really wanted to change for the good, because I knew the kinds of social ministry outreach our church had did, from trying to stop teen homelessness, as an example, help with respite care, local refugee placement. Those were the kinds of programs, helping with medical treatment and lower prescription drugs. These are the kinds of programs that, no kidding, we're going to stop if we weren't, it's not just about attendance, but it's about the local community support. And it's not just our church. These are thousands of churches across the board. We're just a microcosm example. So I felt this tug at me, like when I was thinking about what study am I going to do? And I thought, well, that's not a practice. What am I really going to do with this when I'm done with it? My husband's like, you got to choose something better than that. And I'm like, no, this is the real problem. We have to do something about this. So it's a long-winded answer, but I felt directly affected. Like, if I don't do something about this, what's going to happen to the foundation of what I feel are a lot of community support structures and systems? It looks like there's a hand raised.
Okay. Hi, Dr. Schafer. I just want to say, first of all, that you have a really great study here, and it's very interesting and very informative. But my question was, I know you chose millennials, and I know you mentioned that it probably can go into different areas. Have you, do you think it's possible the study can go as far as with the other age groups, like the Gen Xers or the baby boomers? Because I've seen a lot of times there's some churches that may have a little bit more millennials versus programs for millennials and not enough for the baby boomers, so that either generation will not get lost in that area, and so they continue to still grow no matter what age group they're in. So have you looked at that? Because the reason I ask is I have my study that I'm looking into is kind of thinking about doing is with mental health and utilizing the like clergy for as far as looking at their referral rates since the COVID-19 pandemic. And some of the things I kind of want to, yours kind of touch a little bit on some of the things I'm thinking about.
Right. So thank you for your question. I think that every leader, not just faith-based organization or nonprofit or not-for-profit or for-profit, should be considering all the generations. My research just pointed me in the direction of what are the up and coming opportunities to look at the ones that are maturing into their professional and family life creation, if you will, generation. But there are most certainly issues with all the generations to some extent, those that choose to stray away from participating in churches, as an example, and go elsewhere. So, yep, I found research that was available on the other generations and that viability. I just chose to focus my research on that particular section of generations for that reason. So, so if you can remind me, was the question why I didn't focus on it, or whether I did find additional research on it?
Yeah, well, basically you answered the question.
Okay.
You were saying that, it can also go to other generations as well. And I know you did mainly focus on millennials. So I was just wondering why choosing millennials, was it more data on that, or?
Yeah, in my literature review, I certainly address compared to previous generations. So there is some religious disaffiliation going on, or religiosity trends going on in previous generations. It's just more
Okay.
pronounced and continuing to grow. In fact, if you break the millennial generation into the older and younger half, the older half being born in the 80s and the younger half being born in the 90s,
Yes.
the younger half is even more religiously disaffiliated than the older half.
Okay. Okay. That's good to know. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Open
We
for
have just-
any other questions.
Yep, just a couple of minutes remaining. If there are any other questions or comments, now is the time to ask. All right, if none, we want to thank you, Dr. Schafer, for sharing your research and for your passion around your topic. And we want to thank you all for joining us and engaging in the session.
Thank you, everyone.